Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
There's been a new focus in the country on those who are transgender. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. But the U.S. military have been reluctant in accepting them as their comrades, even with the official lifting of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy that eliminated the official ban on gays and lesbians serving openly. When President Biden first took office, he reversed the Trump administration's efforts to continue the ban on transgender people in the military. And there's a new book out entitled With Honor and Integrity, Transgender Troops in Their Own Words. It's a collection of accounts of current and former transgender members of the military. It's written and co-edited by Máel Embser-Herbert, a sociology professor and Army veteran, and Bree Fram. Fram is a lieutenant colonel in the Space Force and president of Sparta, a transgender military advocacy group, and we have her on the phone this morning. Welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a lot of fun to be here.
So give us a sense, first of all, about history in terms of transgender people. I'm sure they've been serving in the military for decades, if not centuries. What sense do we get about their serving over this long period of time?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that transgender people have been serving as far back as we can possibly look, back certainly to the founding of this country. But documented evidence is hard to come by because identities have so often been protected. But we can see a lot of evidence in the U.S. military, particularly around the Civil War time frame, of people assigned female at birth serving in the country. They hid their identity and served. A great example is Albert Cashier, who fought in numerous battles with the Illinois National Guard and ended up being buried in 1915 in full military honors. Did amazing service to the country. But when we talk about kind of the more recent history, yeah, you do look back to the Don't Ask, Don't Tell period, and that repeal enabling the service of lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, but not trans people who were still barred by medical regulation. Even though we had data showing that trans people have served at twice the rate of their cisgender counterparts, according to the Veterans Affairs Department. So we've had lots and lots of trans people serving through all time, but it's just been in the past 5 years where we've had this roller coaster of being open, being banned, being open again, for us to serve as our authentic selves.
Why do you think that is, that trans were excluded?
So I would postulate that it's based out of ignorance in the most case, or fear of the unknown, of what would it be like. And the same arguments that have been used against trans service were the same arguments that were used against integrating African Americans, integrating women, and integrating lesbians, gays, and bisexuals into the armed services. So in each of those cases, those organizations have proved just how wrong those arguments were. And we couldn't imagine a military today without any of those groups serving in it. And I hope that through the service, the open and honorable service of trans people that we've seen over the past 5 years and going forward, we'll be able to say the same thing in a few years, that a military without trans folks would be just as unconscionable.
Now, you have your own story. Tell me a little bit about that and your experience, especially not only obviously in your relationship to other folks in the military, but this sort of whipsaw, as it were, between, on one hand, trans folks were to be allowed to serve, and then you had the Trump folks come and do their thing, which is to try to reverse it. And then, of course, we have President Biden. What was all that experience like for you?
Well, I think you described it pretty well in calling it a whipsaw. A roller coaster is another apt analogy of back in 2016 when the policy was first announced. It's this moment of elation that people could come out, they could be themselves, and importantly, they could reach their full potential, both as individuals and then also as members of their unit. Because when people don't have to spend mental energy protecting their identity, that can be focused on the mission, and you as a person and you as a member of the team can be more effective. So you go from that high of this is incredible, we can be ourselves, to that crushing low of, oh no, are those of us that were out and open, are we an endangered species? Can no new people get in? Can no new people come out? And how do we operate in this environment where our commander-in-chief has declared us to be a burden on the military? even though for the previous year serving openly, you had all 4 service chiefs testify that there were no issues with regards to transgender service. So you go from the high to the low, and then figuring out, how do you operate in that environment? And we really thought that the best way any of us could move forward was just to lace up our boots and accomplish the mission, because that's the most important thing any of us can do to prove our value to our units, to our teams, to the military, to the country. So when policy came around again this year to be open again, we're excited, we're elated that new folks can reach their potential and our military can tap into individuals that want to bring their talents to the military. But still there's that cloud that, are we going to go the other way again? If we get a new administration to issue a different executive order, how can we make sure that we continue to have that opportunity to serve?
So what was a personal experience for you like coming out, and when did you first realize that you were trans? What was the reaction of your comrades?
Yeah, so I first realized I was trans when I was 3 or 4, even though I didn't have the words to express what that meant or to understand that it was identity. But I got a great picture of me and my sister as Wonder Woman for Halloween when we were really young. But it was something that just kind of went on the back burner for me in terms of figuring out myself and understanding it. But fast forward all the way to 2016 when the Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter first made the announcement that open service was here. I was working in the Pentagon at the time, and as soon as he finished talking, I had an email ready to go to my colleagues, and I also had a post to Facebook and to notify all my friends and family that I was trans. And so when he finished, I was a little nervous because I didn't know what that reaction was going to be. So I built up my courage, I hit post, I hit send, and then I sort of ran away. I went into the bowels of the Pentagon, found the gym, and like to say that I went nowhere faster than I ever had before with all the nervous energy I had riding on the elliptical machine. But when I got back, my colleagues walked over to me one by one, shook my hand, and said, "It's an honor to serve with you." And so I was floored because that was just an incredible reaction. And on Facebook, it was nothing but love from all the people in my life. Sadly, though, it wasn't the same for my wife, who lost a lot of friends and family over it. Her parents, in fact, didn't speak with her for almost a year simply because of who she loved. So there was some heartbreak involved as well. But the reaction from the military side, I think, is important, in my case as an example, but in so many others that we can talk to, and some of which you'll see in the book, of people coming out and being welcomed for who they are. Because what the military values is competency, and what do you bring to the team? And so if that's what you do, if you bring value to the mission, you're likely to be welcomed with open arms.
Referred to Sterling Crutcher was in the Air Force from about 2015 to the present. And one of the quotes I ran across is that it says, "I hate even being labeled trans because it's an identifier of who I am, but actually tells you nothing about who I am." What about that, that idea that people identify you as a particular type of person, and yet, as we all are, we're much more than just our sexual orientation or our gender?
Oh, absolutely. When I talk about identity, and I think the way Sterling is framing it is that we're people that have all the same likes, desires, hopes, and dreams as anyone else. We just happen to be trans. So if I listed my identities, trans might come up like 7th or 8th in the conversation because I'm a guardian in the Space Force. I'm a rocket scientist. I'm a lieutenant colonel. I'm a wife. I'm a parent. I'm a daughter. So many of those things come first, but we just happen to be trans on top of that. So in almost every case, most of us want to be known for all those other things that are who we are, what we do, who we love, and all those amazing things about us, including the fact for our service members that we serve, because we're damn proud of that.
I want to refer to Tucker Duvall, who was in the military from 2008 to 2017, and the remark that he makes is that the idea that there is a a binary sexual uniformity, and that masculinity, there's a certain type of masculinity in the military. What experience did you have with that? I understand it perhaps was even more so even in the Marines.
Yeah, Tucker's is one of the best essays in the book to show that contrast that, not all experiences are great. We're going to have differing relationships between ourselves and the military. And importantly, there's no one way to be trans. There's no one way to be trans in the military. So it's a real nice example of a little bit of a different story. But getting back to what you said about, toxic masculinity and the challenges of certain environments, I mentioned, my story coming out was brought to a very welcoming environment. But I have to acknowledge my privilege in that, in being a senior officer, working in a relatively nerdy career field in the Air Force at the time, being white, being perceived as male. So, yeah, there could be some definite challenges for our African-American or Latino young infantry soldiers in the Army or the Marines, and their experiences may be a little different. But again, even in those units, it's that competency, that value to the team that really makes a difference. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't pockets of bigotry, pockets of hate out there. I'd like to believe that in many cases that's based on ignorance and fear, which we can correct, often through the example of the stories that you'll find in the book or any of those of us individually serving. But sometimes it's something about setting a command climate. So we count on our senior leaders all the way from the top down to set that environment that talks about why we value a diverse and inclusive military that's going to get the mission done, and to use that to make sure that everyone is respected and valued during their service.
One of the terms I ran across was gender dysphoria, which I'd never seen before, but obviously is in the military. Explain that to us. It seemed as if it were sort of this rationale to allow, for instance, trans or people to serve outside of what people would have said was their gender when they were born.
Yeah, gender dysphoria is the clinical term for basically putting medical coding on someone who is transgender to allow them to receive services. And that code has evolved over time. And honestly, I expect that to evolve again shortly when the psychologists basically next meet to evaluate it. But the challenge of gender dysphoria, some of the criteria that go with it, but all military personnel need to get that on their records in order to access care, whether that's the hormones that you need in order to transition or other surgical care. It's kind of that initial step you need to take. So it's not always an easy one to take because of the criteria that says you must experience significant clinical distress, which is why I resisted it for so long, because I never felt distress that made me feel lesser or unable to function. To me, it was basically about accessing the care that would allow me to reach my full potential. And that's the way I think we need to frame it, and the military needs to take advantage of this. So basically, we are giving our troops all the medical care required to enable them to be their best and to perform their wartime mission.
When you look ahead, you mentioned a moment ago we have this executive order. Do you think that being able to serve openly as trans is here to stay, that it's now something that certainly the military has now accepted and would be difficult to reverse? Or do you think it is possible that, say, another administration might come along and reverse it? I mean, is it so ingrained now that trying to pull it back would be fairly difficult?
So I'd like to be optimistic and say that it would be incredibly difficult, but I thought that the first time around, too. I figured taking a step to re-institutionalize discrimination was something that wouldn't be considered. But it happened once. So there's nothing right now that would say it can't happen again. I do think the military is there, and the military is supportive and has seen the advantage of it. But the military is subordinate to civilian rule, and we follow legal orders. So I think that a future administration could flip the switch. It may not be pretty in terms of public reaction, but it could be done, and the military would have to follow those orders. So what I would like to see is congressional action to enshrine the opportunity to serve. We're not asking for the right to serve, but just the opportunity, regardless of gender identity, to be able to serve the military if you meet all other standards.
Because I was wondering just briefly that once these things are in place, with all of the people who would be certainly serving openly, as it were, that it would be pretty difficult to then go ahead and then kind of clamp this thing down again. These steps sort of come along, and just as I think with, say, gays and lesbians and bisexuals serving in the military, that would now become difficult because it's now all embedded inside the institution itself.
Yeah, it's not only would it be difficult and lengthy, but imagine what our military would lose in that case when you're kicking out potentially thousands of trained service members who have done their job, whether it's for 1 year or 25 years. And we don't replace that in a heartbeat. We are not a military that puts a rifle in someone's hand, gives them 2 weeks of training, and sends them off to war. We fight and win based on brain power, and that brain power has to be developed and nurtured so that it's capable of performing the mission that we need. And so we can't simply push out thousands of service members without expecting a major hit to our readiness and capability.
We've been speaking with Bree Fram. She is a lieutenant colonel in the Space Force and also president of Sparta, a transgender military advocacy group. And she has co-authored a book entitled With Honor and Integrity, Transgender Troops in Their Own Words, co-edited with Máel Embser-Herbert, who is also a sociology professor and a former Army veteran. And we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this morning.
Thanks so much for having me.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening. Delmarva Today with Don Rush.